The thing probably surprised her the most was when she realized that she could feel everything. She was standing on her hooves. Her mind hadn't fully come back to her, but she had already had enough awareness and strength to be standing. Though the world was dark around her, she could still sense that something was there. She opened her eyes. A world that was still fairly dark, she found herself in a grassy field, a light breeze blowing through as it swept along her mane. Tilting her head up, the sky was visibly clear, and the bright moon illuminating her world around her, the stars twinkling as they always had. This place had a sense of serenity and calm and peace that Twilight had felt in some time. For the last few days of her life had been spent in so much drench in fear and stress that she almost forgotten what peaceful night felt like. It's truly breathtaking, isn't it? A voice was familiar, but Fortune spoke up from behind her. Twilight tilted her head back just enough to look out the corner of her eye as the approaching yet a figure. His familiar your golden hair practically glowed in the moonlight against his light blue coat, and those ice-cold eyes showed wisdom with age. "Hello, Merlin," Twilight practically whispered as her eyes turned back to the night sky. "You seem to have done so well for yourself, all things considered." Merlin let out a chuckle, walking to stand next to her, and turning his gaze up to look at the sky as well. "I certainly hope my hints were helpful. Being clear to those in the future, while not knowing the full story of yourself, is pretty difficult." "It's hard to say that if they were or weren't," Twilight murmured. "They were cryptic for sure, but I still don't know if I fully understood everything you said, but you were trying to help in some way. I'm sure I wouldn't have made it through without you." "Then I am satisfied with the result." He then nodded his head with satisfaction before looking towards the mare. "I do admit, though, from a few visions of you, I saw I was expecting you to have some sort of barrage of questions for me by now." Twilight wasn't certain of how to respond to that, instead choosing to continue staring up at the sky. The wind brushed past her again, the feeling of a cool night slowly dulling her senses. She closed her eyes for it and looked deep breath before letting out and slowly lowering her head and staring at the grass beneath her hooves. "You're not a memory or illusion this time. Even I can sense that. I remember the last thing I did before I fell unconscious was I found myself here. There is only one conclusion that can be had about it all, isn't there?" Twilight shook her head before turning to face Merlin, a tired, pained smile on her face. "I'm dead, aren't I? To use the Sword of Light while drained your magic means only one thing. To use your very life source of the energy of weapon. Life is when it's used in such a way, can create a vortex of energy and could surpass even alicorns with the terms of destructive capabilities." Merlin smiled, sitting on the lush of grass and brushing up a hoof to the scruff of his hair and face, and he called a beard. He stroked it several times, a bit before the whimsical look on his face as he spoke again. "However, the amount you drew forth could only be enough to shave off a few years of your life at most. I'd wager you're spent about 20 of them casting a spell in that state. Without you using any aging-altering spells, you'd probably still have to live at least 80 years old." Twilight had to blink at that, her pained smile falling into a deep frown. "But if I'm not dead, then how am I talking to you now?" "A natural question." Merlin nodded his head, closing his eyes. "You're on the verge of death, enough to slip into this realm for the time being. But your time has not yet to come yet, Twilight Sparkle. The trained hooves of the medical professionals will save your life when you awaken in Equestria once more soon." "Oh," was all she could seem to be able to say. She looked away from Merlin and to scan the field once more, as if looking for something but unable to locate what she wanted. Her brow furrowed and her lips pierced as she tried to understand what exactly she was saying at the moment. "I was expecting more joyous reaction." Merlin's eyebrow raised curiously. "Aren't you elated to still be alive?" "You'd think I would be." Twilight shook her head again, raising a hoof to rub her head. "Just after everything that's happened in such a short period of time, it's hard to even know what's real and what isn't anymore. The memories of that place will live with you for the rest of your days, Twilight sparkled. You can only use them in some way for the future. Merlin nodded saggily, continuing his train of wisdom. In those visions, you'd always said memory is the key. Is this what you meant? Using my memories to ensure the better future? Did I say that now? Merlin smirked as he fought back to his spells. It's been centuries since I've last cast those spells, so forgive me if my memory is not as clear as it used to be. However, if I spoke those words, it's most likely meant that the key to escaping the cataclysm you have faced, while using the memories presented before you to not only discern the truth, but to use them as a literal key to break through the barriers before you. The truth of the memories. Twilight then shook her head again, closing her eyes and growling at the remembering what she had just seen. The only thing they showed me was that Celestia was not always the kind and be violent one ruler that I know she is. She killed thousands of ponies with her own hooves, betrayed her sister's trust, and caused so much suffering and bloodshed. There was a time in her life when she was a monster, when she was willingly sacrificed the lives of her own people just to save her own. Twilight felt her blood boiling. Merlin's voice was never changed from the near calm to soothing tones that he had spoke since they had arrived. Tell me, Twilight, do you think Celestia is a god? Celestia blinked a question. A god? She asked in confirmation. Yes, a god, an all-knowing, all-seeing force that can bend of every fabric of reality of its whim if need be. Merlin seemed to be amused by his own question. Celestia. Twilight then began to calm down as she thought of the question over. She's the Alicorn, and has been for a long time. She has ruled her kingdom for thousands of years. She's always guided me on the right path. She's showed kindness and strength with all of her actions. She's never faltered to threats of war or political strife, or anything that would bring harm to her or kingdom. She is just a pony, Merlin interrupted her, following his statement with a chuckle. Princess Celestia was not born into this world with the grace of figure that would be defied by its citizens. There was a time when she didn't know the answer for everything, and she was capable of making mistakes, and when those mistakes would cause serious problems. Twilight stared at Merlin, her words lost to her, her mouth reflexively opened to speak, before closing again as if nothing escaped. She turned away to look from him, uncertain of what she really wanted to say. Is she not absolved to her past sins? In fact, I'm certainly way heavy on her heart to this day, but that is exactly why she had become who she is today. Without pain she's caused, she would never have risen to become the ruler you know today, the one who has brought centuries of peace to her love kingdom. You wouldn't think of all of her. That's easy for her lover to say, Twilight grumbled, as she continued to look away from the wiser unicorn. And it should obviously come naturally to her approach edge. Merlin sassed back. Twilight didn't even give a response for that. Two of them just sat in the quiet field together for some time, the wind blowing once more as Twilight's mind tried to justify her anger. However, no amount of justification would let her anger simmer any more than it already had, and slowly the trace of it seeped out of her body, merely replaced with a feeling of apathy. Why did you entrust that spell to me, Merlin? It was the first question that popped into Twilight's mind, so she spoke it, before she could even fully process it. Did my memory not tell you? Merlin tilted his head a bit in confusion at that. It is the greatest spell I have ever crafted, and I entrust it to you. While I could not see it all in the future, I saw that you were a savior of Equestria, time and time again. Whatever you would rule it, or simply continue to follow in Celestia's footsteps, I could never be certain. But in a world that would end several times over, if not for you. Can one pony mean so much? Twilight found it hard to believe. One pony can change the entire world. Merlin smirked at that. My greatest enemy taught me that, if it makes you any better, all in your likelihood, you can blame me for anything. It was all Twilight's turn to raise an eyebrow in confusion. What do you mean? It's more delicate than you may have realized. Something that I've learned from reading Star Swirl's work on the subject. and from my own experiment with it, it's easy to go into the past. In fact, it's even easier to meet yourself in the past, and it's entirely impossible to change the past, to rewrite everything by changing every single event, to cause a ripple of time to go out of place. Merlin raised a hoof lightly twirled in its place. A very fair above this hoof, seemingly to bend the ripple. But then, wherein the lies of any free problem, Twilight Sparkle. If I went back to the past and then returned to the present, and saw nothing was changed and I expected it, would I know if I changed anything or not? Twilight thought that issue over, falling into her own haunches as she considered it. Her own experience with time travel had been short, but it all taught her that messing with it was not something to be used for casual reason. A misused time travel spell could cause a pony to go crazy. A pebble in the pond would have its ripples go unnoticed at first, but over time they would cascade into a torrent of waves, could they not? And what if the reason you went back in time because you knew that ripple and it ended up creating it in the first? You would never know if the past was intended to have a different outcome than the one you interfered with. Time is clever. It changes and it bends all around us for the time being capable of creating several realities all at once, but at the same time, keeping us fixated on the ones we have made for ourselves. I cannot say for certain if I'm responsible for everything that has happened within the dark veil that covers this town, but if you were to cast a wish blame on me for possibly changing the future, I would not hold that against you. Twilight let out another sigh. No, that wouldn't be fair. You did everything in your power to protect Equestria. If the future is changed from this indeeded one, that we could all go from there is to make sure it continues to be happy one for everyone. The words I would expect to hear from a savior, Merlin grinned, enjoying what he heard. I guess I should study time travel a bit more than I had before now. Twilight then shook her head. Perhaps not to travel through it, but to at least deal with the repercussions that may have caused it. I am certain your element will help with that as well. Merlin pointed before Twilight as the image of 6 pointed star appeared above her. The element was magic and tied to every existence of magic itself, such as its close to ties to bending every fabric of reality if needed to be. It closed its ties to time travel. If you want to start understanding how to minimize the casualties, I would start there. Twilight scrunched her face at the explanation before turning to Merlin. Are you going to tell me that the elements of magic has natural time-traveling properties to it? In a sense, Merlin shrugged his shoulders. Have you never felt any sensation if you were viewing events out of order? Twilight then thought about it hard on the subject, trying to remember any time that she had felt of something along those lines. Just as she was about to deny the experiences, her eyes widened as a few certain events came back to her. Right before she had left the library with the spike, she had realized that with the black dragon in the courtyard, and she had realized that the black sword was from the creature from the black orb. Each time she had pictured the horrific event happening, she prevented it by taking a course of action other than the one she saw. I don't need words to see you have. Merlin stroked at the scruff of his chin once more. Yes, if you have already felt the effects, then I have no doubt in my mind that you'll be able to seek what you achieve. Twilight hesitated as the image of 6-sided star faded away from the front view. Merlin, Twilight struggled to find the words. Where exactly am I supposed to go from here? That I do not have an answer for, Twilight. Merlin shook his head, planting both hooves onto the grass beneath him. From here on out, I have not seen any future in all likelihood that has changed from far beyond anything I could have seen earlier. The future could be shaped by your actions after this, so it is on your shoulders now. You're asking me to bear the weight of my own world on my shoulders? Twilight then murmured, a shiver running up her spine, realizing what was going on. You already accepted that responsibility a long time ago. You didn't just realize that in time? Merlin smiled warmly, before a shudder seemed to ripple through the world. Though as it seems our time together has reached its end, for real this time. "I'm waking up?" Twilight asked, looking around as the world began to crumble away slowly, starting from the edges of her vision and slowly moving towards them. "You are. Equestria needs you, and you will be with her again soon." Merlin nodded, standing on his hooves. "But before you go, I have one final request of you, Twilight." Twilight then turned to look back at him. As the darkness of the world was crumbling quickly approached, Merlin gave her one last smile. "Be kind to Celestia. You will want to hate her upon waking up, but she's only a pony. She needs you as much as you need her." With those last words, the dark world crumbled away, and Twilight felt herself fall. A bottomless pit to meet her as she once was comforting wind rushed up and past her body, numbing her senses until she couldn't do anything once more. Her consciousness faded away as it rapidly moved back where it was supposed to be. A soft groan escaped from her lips, first her head shifting against the soft surface. Her head was throbbing and her body was weighed down, like she ran several marathons in a row without stopping. The memory of her talk with Merlin was pushed to the bottom of the back of her mind. For a moment she recalled her last waking thoughts of the hellish landscape and her last moments with Celestia. She needed to open her eyes and see where she was. Her heavy eyelids slowly creaked open, revealing a gentle white light above her head. She expected it to sting her vision, but it was apparently just dimmed enough for her that her opening her eyes the rest of the way wasn't painful. A pristine white ceiling came into view. A fluorescent light, charged by crystal magic, was embedded onto the ceiling, provided the room's light. She tilted her head from one to another side, and saw several IVs hooked to her neck, and a medical arm and a machine quietly whirring with activity as it monitored the vitals. She twisted her head to the side of the room and looked for her vision. It was still blurry, and she could see another pony laying in the bed next to her. She blinked her eyes several times just to adjust her vision to see what it seems like a pony that had noticed her first. "Well, that is a surprise," a feminine voice chuckled slightly. Although Twilight could hear that her voice was hoarse and dry, "We weren't expecting you to wake up for another week at least." The voice was familiar, though foreign at the same time. It sounded like someone's she had just met recently, but it wasn't fully acquainted with yet. She blinked her eyes a few more times before lifting a heavy hoof up to her face to rub them clear. When she lowered her hoof, her vision slowly cleared up at the visage of the white mare with the golden blonde hair came into view. One of her forelegs was wrapped in a heavy cast, several bandages covered her chest, and before the rest of her body was hidden by the streets of her bed. Her eyes looked heavy, bags underneath them, and she looked exhausted. "Yeah, sorry, I can't get up to greet you at the moment. I'm still sort of recovering myself." The blonde-haired mare gently nodded towards the rest of her. "If I wasn't stuck in bed, I'd probably be the one taking care of you at the moment." "We've met before, right?" Twilight asked, trying to think back. Though through her memories, it was a hazy fog moment. She tried to put a name to the face, but she was only drawing a blank. The only blur that she could discern anything from formal greeting at the wedding. It felt so long ago. Weren't you at Fluttershy's wedding? The mare grimaced at the name, but ultimately nodded her head. "I don't blame you for not remembering my name after everything that happened. So let me introduce myself again. My name's Softcure, and I'm a nurse at Cloudsdale Hospital under Dr. Stronshy." "Oh, that's right. You were his date, if I remember correctly." Twilight thought through the meeting of Fluttershy's father again at the wedding. It had been fairly brief meet-up, but she had been busy helping with the preparations. She hadn't seen the Pegasus with Fluttershy's father. "Yeah, I'm glad you remember that at least that much," Softcure said, before leaning back against her bed. "How are you feeling, though?" "Like I went out for a run and didn't stop for a week straight," Twilight muttered, slightly rolling her shoulders as she pushed her head against the pillow. "Every part of me feels so heavy. I could barely keep my eyes open." That's to be expected. Softcure tilted her head a little, her eyes wandering over to the machines next to Twilight's bed. I can't get an accurate reads of your pulse from here, but the machines would alert us if your heart rate was abnormal at all. It's a little hard to tell, but your pupils seem to be dilating at the expected rate. They should with the light in the room. Your breathing looks fine, but I also can't be sure unless I take a closer look. Twilight couldn't help but blink as she watched the mayor try to analyze her from the position of her own bed. Are you in any condition to be trying to practice medicine? She remarked. Yeah, probably not. Softcure lightly shook her head. But I can't help it. I'm not used to being the patient when things get stressful in my life. I sort of put my mind on the job until I can manage it, you know? I love what I do, and it's just so hard to do just laying here. I can understand that. I'm kind of the same way, Twilight murmured as she turned to look up at the ceiling. Whenever I end up faced with a problem, I usually turn to my books and try to find a solution for them, though lately I've been learned that there are many problems you can't solve by looking into one. How are you feeling mentally? The bedridden nurse asked. When you were brought in, you had several lacerations and bruises, but what worried the doctors the most was you literally had a fatal case of magical exhaustion, and the worst of most of them all I've ever seen. They said it was a miracle that your magical revisors weren't permanently damaged from due to how much stress you've put onto them, and likely you would have been unconscious for at least 2 weeks. They managed to stabilize your magic, but you should still be feeling the repercussions of having your magic drained that much. Twilight couldn't even deny the fact that her mind was a heavy blanket, trying to press down on her thoughts at the moment. She'd felt this way once or twice before in her youth, when she was learning the basic magic and trying to push her revisors to their limit. She had only passed out from pushing them too far once, and she had woken up with a similar fuzzy feeling in her head. She felt that her twinges of it, she pushed her magic too far, but this was the first time it felt like a fuzzy feeling, wanting to suffocate her. I can't deny how that feels, Twilight mumbled as she closed her eyes. I pushed my magic far beyond the breaking point, and now it's affecting my everything. Her mind was so slow to process everything going on at the moment, even dulling her emotions to the situation. Softcure's words hadn't landed on the deaf ears, though, and within the exact moment, something clicked in her mind and she wanted to turn to the mayor again. Wait, how long have I been asleep exactly? If my mind's not too long going to go, it's been 6 days, Softcure said, quickly double-checking her mind on how many days she had passed. Twilight blinked before trying to lift her head up off the pillow in shock, only to feel the exhaustion pull her back down and hitting it with a soft thump. 6 days? What happened to Ponyville? Softcure thought it over for a moment before speaking up. Probably best to start from the beginning then. They haven't told me everything yet, but although you've been with the princess's protege, and I'm pretty sure they'd tell you the whole story soon. The nurse shifted a little uncomfortably as she tried to figure out the proper place to start. It seems like whatever happened was a town-wide event, and we were all caught up on it. At some point, Princess Luna noticed the sun hadn't risen yet and decided to raise it herself after looking for Princess Celestia. At the first place, she went to look at Ponyville and found the town covered in a thick fog. The Pegasi were unable to clear it, so they sent in a small search party to try and figure out what was going on, and when they failed to return, the town was quarantined until the scholars from Canterlot could arrive and dispel it. They were studying for hours, and when the fog finally cleared up on its own, with the fog clear, they went into town just found its citizens. Most were stricken but unharmed, though several were severely injured. Softcure's eyes wandered down to the heavy bandages on her own body. You and I were rushed to Canterlot General for a greater chance of survival, and well, here we are. The nurse tilted her head and looked up at the ceiling. I've been pretty out of it myself, so it hasn't felt like much time since it's passed for me. But I can even tell these days have passed without any horrific visions returning. Seems like we made it out here alive. Twilight wasn't comforted by the story, although what happened on the outside certainly put the things into perspective. It hadn't been a single instance. Everyone in town had got caught up with whatever happened. That most likely meant the bodies of the citizens she'd run into were the real deal. That thought only made her tighten her grip on her sheets. Before Twilight could even ask the burning question that had been raising up on the top of her mind, 2 heavy knocks rang out from her door before the latch was turned and it swung open. Turning her head, she walked into the room. It was someone Twilight recognized right away. She had been pressed hard to find other Pegasi that bore the striking red hair mixed with amber coat, not to mention the worn-down look of the constant bags under his eyes. He took a few steps before, raising an eyebrow in surprise, noticing the patient that he had expected to awaken was staring at him. "Miss Sparkle, I am surprised to see you awake." Lance didn't even hide his unique surprise from his voice, though it came out as dulled with his usual tone. "I suppose there's no end to the miracles that you can perform." He then closed the door behind him and walked up to examine his patient. "Dr. Strongshine?" Twilight responded. To her own surprise, Dr. Seuss quickly pressing against her neck to check at her heartbeat. "I thought you worked at Cloudsdale. What are you doing here in Canterlot?" "Special circumstances, all things considered," he simply muttered, seemingly satisfied with her pulse. "A lot of doctors have been diverted into hospitals in Ponyville, so Canterlot is a little short-staffed at the moment. Plus, you two are the most important cases for me at the moment, so I offered to handle your care, and they agreed." "I see," Twilight murmured, having a hard time trying to come up with a response to that. Lance quickly went through a few series of tests, checking her pupil dilation, her breathing rate, and other minor physicals to get a read on Twilight's condition. "All things you considered, you're very, very fortunate, Miss Sparkle," Lance explained, pulling out a clipboard and flapping the page to the top page. "You'll likely need bed rest for the exhaustion for the next few days or so, but you're on track to making a full recovery." "What about the others?" Lance raised an eyebrow at Twilight's question. "My friends from Ponyville, where are they? What happened to them?" "Oh, on the other elemental barriers," Lance acknowledged, once they came to my mind. "Don't worry not, Miss Sparkle. They are perfectly healthy and they've been staying at a nearby hotel. They visited you on an hour ago. In fact, they'll be elated to hear that you're awakened." The tension had been building up in Twilight's chest loosened her body, and her body sank into the bed in relaxation. "They're okay," Twilight murmured, a loud faint smile coming from her lips as she let out a relaxed sigh. The town hadn't been taken from her. She still had her friends. She wanted to go out and see them right now, but she knew her body wouldn't make it on its own. "How soon can I see them?" "I'll send someone to get them as soon as I'm done checking up on you both." Lance nodded with a smile. Twilight had to admit, from the few times she had met the stallion, she found himself to be somewhat cold and almost standoffish, and even though he was trying to be open and polite to her, seeing him at the patient's bedside painted with a different picture of the stallion, though. His bedside manners were incredible. It's almost as if he was entirely a different person. But the next speak was Twilight's stomach, a loud growl making its way through the sheets. Twilight blinked and her face flushed with a little at that. A perfectly normal reaction after just being woken up from days of sleep. Lance nodded. He wrote something down on the clipboard. "I'll send them up some dinner at the same time." "Thank you," Twilight nodded, as she leaned back into the comforts of her bed. She was rather surprised with how comfortable it actually was now, and she had the moment to relax and felt the sensations of her bed. "Let me check up on my other patient and I'll send for them," Lance nodded, as he made his way around to Twilight's bed to soft cures. Twilight simply nodded her head as she closed her eyes and let the warmth of the comfort of her bed take hold of her. "How are you holding up, Soft Cure?" Lance's voice asked almost soothingly. "I'm recovering fine, though. It looks like you haven't been sleeping again," Soft Cure scolded the doctor. "You wouldn't do us any good if you're passing out." "You're probably the only patient I've had that would reprehend me for my last state of health." Lance couldn't help but chuckle at that. Their words were comforting to Twilight, and it was almost as if she could put everything on hoof, and everything happened before her that moment. Things had returned to relative normality. she couldn't even afford to rest a little longer. Twilight! The loud, boisterous voice of Twilight's older brother filled the small hospital room after he had dramatically burst through the door. Twilight stopped in mid-chew of the hospital salad and looked up in surprise. Twilight quickly swallowed a bit of food in her mouth and let her mouth hang agape at the sight of the familiar face that she hadn't seen in so long. Her eyes instantly began to sting with the feeling of tears swelling up as the older stallion rushed over and wrapped his hooves around his little sister. "Shining!" Twilight murmured, a big smile spreading upon her face as she buried herself into her brother's barrel. The older, stronger stallion was already beginning to bawl like a baby, and it filled Twilight with so much warmth in her own tears streaming down her cheeks. She wrapped her heavy legs around him in return. "How did you get here so fast? I thought you'd still be on duty in the castle." It took Shining Armor several deep breaths to hold back his sobs and let go of Twilight from the hug long enough to take her into several look of the eyes. A big smile was on his face. "Once I got the word you were being sent here, I requested permission to be stationed here as a guard. I've been making my own rounds to the hospital to ensure its safety since you've been out. So the moment I heard you were awake, I had to come and see you." He shook his head and wrapped her in the tight hug once more. "Thanks, Celestia, you're okay." Twilight flinched at the word Celestia, but eased back in the embrace of her brother. She could push the thoughts of Princess Celestia out of her mind for a moment and just focus on here and now. "Hey, any room for me?" Another familiar voice crawled out. Twilight blinked and pulled away from her brother, just for a moment to look at all the pink mare with long purple, violet, and yellow hair that curled up around her side. Twilight blinked a few times before noticing her wearing a familiar set of golden regala, as well as some sporting pair of wings on her side. "It's been a long time, Twilight. I'm happy to see you again." The gears clicked in Twilight's mind just long enough for her name to appear in her mind, and Twilight brightened for the second time. "Cadence!" Twilight reached for her face hoof out to the older mare, and soon three of them were embraced with a long-deserved hug. "I haven't seen you in forever. I was so busy with my studies I haven't kept up with what you've been up to." "You always do have your head buried in the books." Canes likely chuckled, and then she pulled back just enough to look in Twilight in the eyes, though Shining Armor seemed a little reluctant to stop at hugging his baby sister. "I haven't been doing anything at all exciting anyway, mostly just a lot of formal princess training and meeting with the politicians. Nothing too extraordinary." Canes then let out a smirk showing through. "Oh, and dating your brother, of course. Can't forget that one." Twilight's jaw then went to slack again as she looked down between the older ponies, blinking as if expecting one of them to speak up, as if it was a joke. "Yeah, surprise." Shining tried to chuckle at his embarrassment, away over to the news dropping. "You're dating my babysitter and Princess Equestria. Didn't you not tell me?" Twilight let out an annoyed huff for a moment, before her lips quivered and broke into a smile, unable to keep up the facade of the angry little sister. "Oh my gosh, that is so wonderful. You two deserve each other so much," she teared, clapping her hooves together in excitement. It was the best news she had ever heard in a very long time. "I thought you could use some good news after everything that happened." Kane smiled as she leaned in and nuzzled against Twilight comfortably. "They wouldn't tell us everything, but it seems like you went through something pretty traumatic, and we just wanted you to know that we're here to support you. We've got your back no matter what. I know you could take care of yourself, but if you ever need the strongest members of the Royal Guards to back you up, all you gotta do is call." Shining boasted proudly, before leaning in to nuzzle Twilight as well. "Thank you, both of you. Thank you so much," Twilight murmured as she felt the tears beginning to well up in her eyes. "Uh-oh, it looks like this room's already about to get crowded." Softcare's voice chuckled from her viewpoint of the events. Twilight blinked over and looked over the hospital room partner, and noticed her eyes were looking out of the window of the door. Twilight turned to follow her gaze, and a distinct assortment of colors racing down the hallway towards the room. Shining and Cadence turned to look to see a group of ponies racing towards the room, before grinning and stepping out of the way. Twilight braced herself for the impact of the assortment of colors just burst forth with a small opening. "Twilight!" A collective cheers of her 5 best friends hens, she cried out as she swarmed with hugs within the next moment. Each of their voices scrambled together as they tried to essentially say the same thing. How about they were all worried about her, and how if they've been visiting every day? They were so glad to see her awake now. Girls, I'm so glad you're all okay too. Twilight laughed joyously, doing her own best to return each of the hugs as more tears spilled down her cheeks. They were okay. All of them were generally okay. She sneaked peeks at Rarity's torso, saw no signs of scarring or appendages that would indicate having to be pierced by a black sword. Fluttershy and Rainbow Dash were perfectly healthy. Even Applejack seemed no worse than for wear. Each of the ponies with boundless energy found it within themselves to keep calm, just long enough to give Twilight some breathing room, soaking in the happiness that she was surrounded by those who cared about her most. She almost looked around at all their faces, elated with joy as they cared all so much about her, and it's just as much she cared about them. She didn't even know what she would do if she lost any of them. Even though it may have been hazy fog still clouding her mind, she couldn't help but get the feeling that something was missing, a small niggling feeling at the back of her mind that she was still forgetting about something.